In the spring of 1834, deep in the quiet hills of central Virginia, something was discovered that changed the way people thought about human darkness forever. 47 children, ages 6 to 16, were found chained in the basement of what looked like just another farmhouse. They didn't look alike, they spoke different languages, and when authorities tried to talk to them, they could only whisper one name through tears: Mother Sullivan. The sheriff's report, locked away in the Henry County archives for more than 100 years, described scenes so disturbing that 3 of the officers quit within a week. The most unsettling part wasn't just what was found, but the realization that Constance Sullivan had been running her horrifying operation for over 20 years without anyone noticing. The children called her Mother, but the truth behind that name was far more twisted than anyone could imagine. Before we dive into the terrible story of the Sullivan family and their secrets, I have to ask you something. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of America's past. If you're still here, you're not like most people. You know that some truths are too dark to ignore, no matter how much they scare us. So hit that subscribe button and join a community of people who are just as fearless as you, and tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Could you handle stories like this happening right in your own backyard? The question that haunted investigators back then, and still bothers historians today, is how something this massive could go completely unnoticed in such a small, close-knit town. Virginia in 1834 was a place stuck between two worlds. The old plantation way of life was still strong, but whispers of change were drifting in from the north. Millbrook was just a small farming community, maybe 50 families spread out over the rolling hills. People grew tobacco and corn, traded at Henderson's General Store, and met up for events at the little one-room schoolhouse. The Sullivan farm sat on the edge of this community, a plain 2-story wooden farmhouse with nearly 200 acres of good farmland. To anyone passing by on the road to Richmond, it looked completely normal. The house was built in the Federal-style popular in the 1810s. White siding, wraparound porch, a red barn about 60 yards back, with chicken coop and smokehouse. But what made the Sullivan farm different couldn't be seen from the road. Ezra Sullivan, who bought the land in 1809 with money from his father's tobacco fortune, had spent years expanding the basement. Most houses back then just had a simple root cellar, but Ezra's basement was huge, far bigger than the house above it. Local craftsmen later said they were hired for different digging jobs through the 1810s and 1820s, but no one ever saw the full finished project. Ezra always paid well, in cash, and told workers to stick to their assigned section and not worry about the rest. Constance Sullivan came to Millbrook in 1811, a 22-year-old bride with dark hair and a soft voice. She dressed plainly, went to church when she could, and had a reputation for being generous. When people asked why there were children around the property, she explained they were orphan relatives from Pennsylvania, and that she and Ezra were just caring for them until homes could be found. That was enough to quiet people's curiosity. Mrs. Henderson at the store sometimes saw a small face peeking from the wagon when Constance came for supplies, but the children never spoke. Constance would just say they were shy and still grieving their parents. Every 2 weeks, she came with a big shopping list and plenty of cash, buying flour, cornmeal, salt, pork, molasses, medicine. The amount was a little much for a childless couple, but whenever Thomas Henderson mentioned it, she'd remind him about the orphans. Neighbors noticed that the Sullivans kept odd hours. While most farms shut down at dusk, the Sullivan house stayed busy well into the night. Lights in the windows, the sound of hammering or construction echoing across the fields. When asked, Ezra said he was making improvements to house more children. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling doctor for the area, remembered being called to the Sullivan farm several times during the 1820s and early 1830s. Constance would tell him a child was sick and ask for medicine, but never let him see the child. When the doctor insisted, she'd say the children were too frightened of strangers and too traumatized to be looked at. Even the local pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, believed in the Sullivan family's kindness. He'd visit the farm from time to time, praising Constance and Ezra for their Christian charity in caring for so many poor children. He even offered to help find homes for them, but Constance would gently explain that she was already in touch with relatives in Pennsylvania who would soon take the children. Everything, she said, just needed time and careful planning. No one in Millbrook knew the truth. Constance Sullivan wasn't rescuing children. She was collecting them. The orphans weren't waiting for a better life. They were prisoners, stolen, bought, or tricked from their families across several states, and held in conditions that could make even the toughest person break down in tears. The nightmare started to unravel in early 1834. That February was brutally cold, the kind of winter where the ground stayed frozen solid for weeks. For the 47 children locked in the Sullivan basement, the bitter weather would turn out to be both a curse and a strange kind of salvation. On February 23rd, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was on his way from Richmond to Charlottesville when a sudden snowstorm forced him off the road. The Sullivan farm was the only place in sight, so he stopped to ask for shelter. Ezra seemed reluctant but couldn't refuse a traveler in such dangerous weather. Later, Stern would recall that the whole evening felt wrong. Constance served him a plain supper of cornbread and salt pork, but the conversation was stiff and uneasy. The couple kept glancing at each other, as if afraid of something. When Stern asked about the children, Constance said they were all sick and sleeping. But that night, as Stern lay awake in the parlor, he heard it. Faint, muffled crying coming from beneath the floorboards. When he mentioned it to Ezra in the morning, Ezra brushed it off, saying it was just the wind howling through cracks in the old foundation. Stern accepted the explanation, but the feeling in his gut never went away. 3 weeks later, on March 15th, tragedy struck again. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish girl traveled with her family to find work near Richmond, got separated during a river crossing. Alone and terrified, she stumbled upon the Sullivan farm. Constance offered her food and shelter for the night. Mary Catherine was never seen alive again. Her family reported her missing, and a search party combed the countryside. But Virginia was wild and unforgiving. After a week, the search was called off. People assumed she had frozen to death or been killed by animals. Then came the moment that blew the whole case open. On April 2nd, a farmer named William Hutchinson was hunting rabbits in the woods near the Sullivan place when he heard something that froze him in his tracks. Children screaming. Not playful shouting, not laughter, screams of pure terror. Hutchinson crept closer, hiding behind a cluster of oak trees just 50 yards from the house. For nearly an hour, he listened. The screams came in bursts, always from beneath the house. Then he saw it. Ezra Sullivan stepping out of the cellar door hidden on the side of the farmhouse. Ezra looked around nervously before vanishing back underground. When Hutchinson told the neighbors what he had seen, the community split. Some believed the children might be troubled and needed strict discipline. Others began remembering all the strange details. The huge amount of food Constance bought, the strange noises at night, and how none of the orphans ever came town. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, a seasoned lawman with 15 years on the job, dismissed the gossip at first. But when Hutchinson filed a formal complaint, Crawford was legally obligated to investigate. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford and his deputy, Marcus Webb, rode out to the Sullivan farm. They expected to do a quick check and put the rumors to rest. Constance greeted them politely, even offered them coffee. She repeated the story about caring for orphans and showed them letters from relatives in Pennsylvania. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until Deputy Webb excused himself to go outside. Walking around the house, he found the cellar door. 3 heavy padlocks sealed it shut, thick chains wrapped around the handles, and the wood around the door was torn and splintered, as if someone had clawed at it from the inside, desperate to get out. When Webb came back in and quietly told Sheriff Crawford what he'd seen, they both knew this wasn't just neighborhood gossip anymore. Sheriff Crawford looked at Constance and calmly asked her to open the cellar. Sheriff Crawford stayed calm, politely explaining that a full inspection of the cellar would help put all the rumors to rest. The change in Constance Sullivan was immediate and terrifying. Her face drained of color. Her hands shook. She stammered that the cellar was dangerous, that no one, not even the children, was allowed down there. She insisted there was nothing to see but old farm tools. And that's when it happened. From beneath their feet came the sound of crying. Then a faint, desperate voice called out for help. The sound was coming from directly below the kitchen. What happened next would haunt Sheriff Crawford until his last day. He and Deputy Webb forced the cellar door open. The smell hit them like a physical blow, a choking stench of human waste, sweat, sickness, and something worse, something Crawford later described as the smell of despair itself. The basement was like something out of a nightmare. It stretched far beyond the house above, a maze of carefully built stone walls designed to muffle sound. In the largest chamber, right beneath the kitchen, they found them, 47 children, chained to iron rings in the walls, each one shackled by the ankle. They were skeletal, their clothes hanging in filthy rags. Many were coughing, feverish, covered in sores from living underground with no fresh air. What chilled the men the most wasn't the sight, it was the silence. After that first desperate cry, the children said nothing. They just stared with hollow eyes, as if rescue was something they no longer believed in. Deputy Webb, a father of 4, had to run back upstairs twice just to vomit. Crawford, a hardened sheriff with 15 years of service, stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was looking at. The deeper they went, the worse it got. One smaller room contained stocks and restraints, punishment devices. Another looked like a crude medical station, not for care, but to keep the children alive and usable. And then there were the records, detailed ledgers listing names, ages, dates of arrival, notes about behavior. Proof that this had been running like a system for over 20 years. More than 90 children had passed through this basement since 1812. The question no one wanted to ask had a horrifying answer. A narrow tunnel led to a final chamber. There, in shallow lime-covered graves, lay the remains of at least 36 children. Some had starved. Some had died from disease. Others had clearly been killed. The investigation that followed lasted for months. Piece by piece, the truth came out. Constance Sullivan had built a life around deception. She had played the perfect role, the good Christian woman caring for the helpless. She had fed the town exactly the story it wanted to hear. The children were trained to call her mother. If anyone overheard them, it would sound normal. They were told their real families had abandoned them, that no one was coming to save them, that the outside world was dangerous. Those who obeyed were given a little more food. Those who didn't were punished publicly to scare the others into silence. Neighbors began to remember all the strange details they had ignored. The odd hours, the big food orders, the lights burning at night. At first, some of the community refused to believe it. Not Constance, they said. Not the kind, soft-spoken woman we've known for 20 years. But as more evidence came to light, denial was no longer possible. The records found in the Sullivan basement didn't just list the children. They exposed something much bigger. Constance Sullivan wasn't working alone. The letters discovered in that underground hell revealed that she had been part of a network, a system of criminals trafficking children across state lines. The Sullivan farm was just one piece of a much larger nightmare, stretching from Pennsylvania to Georgia. The letters, written in a simple code, were eventually deciphered. They spoke of merchandise, deliveries, and quality control. One letter, dated only 3 months before discovery, came from someone signing as Morrison in Philadelphia. I have 6 new items of varying ages and conditions suitable for your requirements. It listed the children, their ages, health, and even their temperaments, noting which were compliant and which would require additional training. The financial records were just as horrifying. Over $8,000 had changed hands, a fortune in the 1830s. Proving the farm wasn't just a prison, it was a distribution hub for human trafficking. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the local doctor who had been to the farm many times, became a key witness. Under questioning, he admitted that Constance had always been unusually knowledgeable about medicine, requesting treatments for malnutrition, lung infections, fevers, and even sedatives that could keep children docile. This wasn't random cruelty. It was systematic. Constance had studied how to keep large groups of children alive in captivity for years, maximizing their survival while minimizing cost. Even the basement's design showed her twisted intelligence. It wasn't just a prison, it was efficient. Local shopkeeper Thomas Henderson's sales records painted the rest of the picture. Constance's increasing orders of food, clothing, and medicine matched the growing number of children held at the farm. And Ezra Sullivan? He wasn't just a bystander. Survivors later describe him as the enforcer, the one who carried out punishments and made sure no one dared to escape. The basement he built wasn't just big. It had been refined over the years to be an almost perfect containment system. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from the ledgers that tracked the children's fates. Some were marked as transferred, sent to other buyers. Others were marked unsuitable. Those marks matched the bodies later uncovered in the burial chamber under the farm. The investigation quickly grew beyond Henry County. Missing children reports from Pennsylvania, Maryland, North and South Carolina matched the profiles of those found under the Sullivan house. Poor, orphaned, or from families too powerless to search for long. Federal marshals were called in, making this one of the first criminal cases in U.S. history to cross state lines and involve federal authorities. Then the survivors began to speak. Their stories were terrifyingly consistent. Years of imprisonment, beatings, manipulation, and conditioning. New arrivals were broken through isolation and punishment until they accepted their new life. Older children were given privileges, a little more food, slightly better conditions, if they helped keep the younger ones in line. Some children, so deeply brainwashed, initially resisted rescue, believing that the world outside was even more dangerous than the cellar. Constance Sullivan had told them they were worthless, that their parents had sold them, that no one cared. And some of them believed her. Even as the investigation revealed more names, more letters, more connections to a criminal network, one truth became clear. The Sullivan farm had been expanding. The number of children held there was increasing year after year. Had William Hutchinson not heard those screams in the woods that day, there's no telling how much longer the Sullivan operation would have continued, or how many more children would have vanished into its darkness. The letters also revealed something even darker. Plans to build more facilities just like the Sullivan farm. The raid hadn't just stopped one horror. It had cut off a criminal empire that was on the verge of massive expansion. The key that blew the entire case wide open came from a survivor. Her name was Rebecca, 14 years old, the longest-held prisoner in the Sullivan cellar. Unlike many of the others, Rebecca had never fully broken. She remembered everything. The night she was taken from her family's farm in Pennsylvania in 1829, the woman who lured her away with sweets and a promise of a trip to town, and the moment she woke up chained in the dark. But her memory was more than personal. She remembered conversations, names, dates, deals. She could recall every visitor who had ever come to the farm and what Constance Sullivan said to them. Rebecca's testimony gave law enforcement something they'd never had before, a clear map of the network, other farms, other safe houses, shipments of children being traded like cattle. The most chilling detail came from just 2 weeks before the discovery. A wealthy man had arrived at the farm in a fine carriage, flanked by 2 associates. For children, including Rebecca, had been lined up for inspection. The man examined them like livestock, checking their teeth, their muscles, their health. None met his standards. He complained that the children were too damaged and left behind a letter with specific requirements for future deliveries, age ranges, physical descriptions, and even preferred personality traits. The letter was signed, H. Blackwood, Charleston, South Carolina. When authorities followed the lead, they discovered Henry Blackwood was a wealthy plantation owner who had been buying children for years, not just as servants, but for purposes far darker than the Sullivan operation. The Blackwood connection opened up a horrifying new chapter. Evidence showed that trafficked children had been used as laborers who could be worked to death with no one to notice, as subjects for medical experiments, and, according to some witnesses, for violent forms of entertainment that investigators refused to fully detail in official reports. This was no longer just a local crime. It was a national scandal, one that involved powerful Southern families with money and influence to protect themselves. And then the intimidation started. Sheriff Crawford received anonymous letters warning him to stop the investigation. Deputy Webb was attacked one night while walking home. Dr. Whitfield's medical practice was suddenly boycotted by wealthy townsfolk. The message was clear: stay quiet or face the consequences. When one of the rescued children, a boy named Timothy, vanished from the shelter where he had been kept under watch, everyone knew what had happened. His body was never found. Despite the danger, the investigation pressed forward. Federal marshals guarded the farm and relocated the surviving children to hidden, secure locations. This had become more than a case. It was a test of whether the American justice system could hold the rich and powerful accountable. And then the unthinkable happened. Constance Sullivan was found dead in her jail cell. The official cause was suicide, but no one believed it. She had been scheduled to testify and name every buyer and contact in the network. With her death, the investigation lost its most important witness. The case nearly collapsed. But then, a breakthrough. A man named Samuel Pierce, a former overseer on the Blackwood plantation, came forward. Guild had been eating him alive, and he brought with him detailed records, names, dates, payment ledgers that connected the Sullivan farm directly to the Southern buyers. He had seen what had happened to those children. He had seen how they lived, and he had seen how they died. Samuel Pierce's testimony became the final key that unlocked the entire case, and it remains one of the most harrowing accounts ever given in an American courtroom. Pierce, a man with weathered hands and eyes hollowed by guilt, had worked on a Blackwood plantation for more than a decade. What he revealed silenced the room. The plantation, he said, had two worlds. The first was what everyone saw: the cotton fields, the enslaved labor, the familiar brutality of Southern agriculture. But hidden beyond the main grounds was something far worse, what Pierce called the experimental quarters. Here, the children purchased from the Sullivan network were kept, not as laborers, but as test subjects. Pierce described in chilling detail how Henry Blackwood and two physicians from Charleston Medical College used the children for medical experiments. They starved them, drugged them, infected them with diseases, and recorded how long it took them to die. They wanted to know how much suffering the human body could endure, and the children were their data. Blackwood documented everything: meticulous records of symptoms, survival times, and responses to various tortures disguised as treatments. Out of at least 37 children sent from the Sullivan farm, only 4 lived long enough to be sold again. The rest were buried in unmarked graves on the edge of the plantation. And then came Pierce's most horrifying revelation. In the autumn of 1833, Blackwood had hosted what he called a demonstration for wealthy buyers across the South. It was an auction. Pierce said the children were paraded before the guests, forced to perform tasks, beaten to show how they reacted to punishment, and examined like livestock. Buyers placed orders on the spot. Some asked for strong children for labor. Others asked for quiet ones for private use. The entire event, Pierce said, was treated like a festive business gathering, as though they were discussing cattle prices, not human lives. His testimony revealed just how vast the network had become. Children were being bought and sold across the country, with politicians, judges, and businessmen among the buyers. Federal marshals acted quickly. Secret raids were launched across multiple states, targeting plantations, warehouses, and safe houses. The results stunned the nation. Over 100 children were rescued and mountains of records were seized: ledgers, letters, payment logs, undeniable proof of conspiracy. Among those arrested were Henry Blackwood, the 2 Charleston physicians, and even a Georgia state legislator who had been one of the network's most prolific buyers. The documents show that this criminal enterprise had been running for over 3 decades, victimizing hundreds of children and operated with a level of coordination that was unheard of for the era. What shocked the public even more was the corruption that had kept it all hidden. Orphanages had been paid to supply children. Judges had signed off on fraudulent adoptions that were really sales. Some sheriffs had been bribed to look the other way, while others had helped silence parents who came searching for their missing children. The trials dragged on for years. Many powerful figures escaped justice through bribes, technicalities, or political protection. But thanks to Pierce's testimony and the records seized during the raids, the core of the network was destroyed. For the first time, America had been forced to confront the reality of organized child trafficking, and it left scars on a national conscience that would never fully heal. The Sullivan case did not simply end with convictions. It changed America. Its shockwaves are felt far beyond the courtroom. Newspapers dedicated entire issues to its revelations, and for the first time, Americans began speaking openly about the dangers facing orphaned and abandoned children. The Sullivan case became the catalyst for the first federal legislation against child trafficking and abuse. Within months, Virginia passed sweeping child protection laws, the first of their kind, requiring government oversight of orphanages, stricter adoption procedures, and background checks for those seeking to care for children. Other states soon followed, laying the groundwork for the modern child welfare system. The legal battle stretched on for nearly 5 years. Ezra Sullivan was convicted of kidnapping, murder, and unlawful imprisonment. He was hanged before a crowd of thousands on November 15, 1836. Witnesses reported his last words were a tearful confession and a plea for forgiveness from the children whose suffering he had overseen. Henry Blackwood's trial became a national spectacle. The medical records taken from his plantation exposed an organized program of torture disguised as scientific research. Though his execution was delayed for years through political influence, Blackwood died in prison in 1841, officially from a heart attack, though some suspected poison to keep him silent. The 2 Charleston physicians were stripped of their medical licenses and given lengthy prison sentences, sparking new regulations for medical ethics and research on human subjects. But the case also left behind bitter frustration. Many powerful men who had bought children through the network escaped justice, fleeing the country or using political connections to secure lenient treatment. A Georgia state legislator implicated as one of the network's largest buyers was censured but never criminally charged. The Sullivan farm itself became infamous. Though the land was eventually sold, no one wanted to live there. The house was demolished in 1845. The cursed basement was filled with concrete, and a small memorial cemetery was built to honor the children who died there, most of whose names were never known. For the 47 children rescued from the Sullivan basement, survival was only the beginning. Many required years of medical care and emotional rehabilitation. Some never recovered. Rebecca, the brave 14-year-old whose testimony exposed a wider network, was eventually placed with a quiet Quaker family in Pennsylvania. She lived to the age of 73, raising a family of her own, but never spoke publicly about her experiences again. The Sullivan case fundamentally changed how Americans thought about child welfare. The romanticized idea of the benevolent caretaker gave way to a sober understanding that vulnerable children needed oversight, legal protections, and systemic safeguards. The phrase "another Sullivan case" entered the public lexicon as a grim warning about the dangers of unchecked authority over children. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, whose medical visit had unwittingly sustained the Sullivan operation, devoted the rest of his career to child health. He established free clinics for orphans and became a national voice for medical ethics, writing extensively about the duty of physicians to detect and report abuse. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford was promoted to U.S. Marshal and became one of the first lawmen to specialize in pursuit of human traffickers, setting precedents for federal investigations that would shape law enforcement for decades. In the end, the Sullivan case was not just a story of a single farmhouse in Virginia. It was a warning, a reminder that evil can thrive in silence, hidden in plain sight, until someone dares to break the locks and let the truth come screaming into the light. The Sullivan case became more than just a courtroom drama. It became a mirror, forcing America to face its own darkest truths. Crawford's meticulous reports turned into required reading for generations of law enforcement officers, shaping investigative techniques for decades. The rescued children's stories revealed both the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the lifelong scars left by systematic abuse. Some, like Rebecca, were able to rebuild their lives. Others were haunted until their last days, unable to escape the trauma of their imprisonment. The correspondence found in the Sullivan basement continued to yield clues for years, uncovering other operations and leading to additional prosecutions, though many perpetrators were never caught. Perhaps the most chilling revelation was that the Sullivan farm was not an isolated case, but part of a much larger, hidden network of exploitation that had thrived in plain sight for decades. Millbrook's residents wrestled with guilt. How had they missed the signs? Could they have stopped it sooner? Their questions became a national conversation about the responsibility communities have to protect their most vulnerable. The Sullivan case remains a warning about the danger of blind trust, that evil often hides behind respectability, and that polite silence can be its greatest ally. In the end, this empire of cruelty was not destroyed by some grand government operation, but by ordinary people. A farmer who refused to stay quiet, a sheriff who took his concerns seriously, and a young girl who found the courage to speak the truth. The basement where 47 children were found remains sealed to this day. Yet its silence still speaks, a chilling reminder of why we must remain vigilant, why courage matters, and why these stories must never be forgotten. If this story gave you chills, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our work, and subscribe so you never miss what we uncover next. Evil hides in the most ordinary places, and together we will keep bringing it into the light.